Thanks, Alan. Yes, so as you can see, I've written a methodology book called Teaching Lexically. Although it has Lexis in the title, it is very much about teaching all aspects of language, and a lexical approach is kind of the idea is combining words and grammar. As well as that, I've written many course books. The latest course books are the third editions of Outcomes. I've also written a series called Innovations and a couple of books in a roadmap. And I've also written this book, Grammar Nonsense and What to Do About It. A couple of the things mentioned in there we'll touch upon as we go through this webinar, but it's essentially about how some of the explanations and ways of dealing with grammar that we see in many course books are maybe not as useful or good as we might want them to be. And this kind of really brings me to the fundamental starting point here, that when we talk about teaching grammar creatively, it really depends on what you mean by grammar, what your idea of creativity is, and really your broader beliefs about language or learning. You might want to think about what those three things are for you briefly. But I think there are two kind of main ways we'll be looking at it in this way during this webinar. The first is what I would call the dominant view of grammar, and that is grammar is seen as a set of rules, and we add words to this grammar to make our meanings. So from a teaching point of view, what we do is we explain the rules. We hope that the students learn them, but as we'll see, there may be problems there. And we do this in a kind of building block way, from working from the simple to what we might call the complicated, and you master each structure, moving on to onto each one as we go forward. I say mastering, I mean really that there's a kind of full-on practice. We kind of study it for a period of time, and then we move on to the next. And then as we go along, we correct students' grammar based on these rules, and then often the response to that is further explanation. So if you take this kind of dominant view, then what we do in terms of creativity kind of often fits into this pattern. Looking at this kind of rules-based thing, here's a kind of typical thing that we could see from a Russian textbook, because I was learning Russian a while back. We have rules, we're given a table, we've shown the patterns, these are what we present to the students. We have the same in English course books. It's from a quite a well-known course book, where they're in the beginner or elementary level. The students get all of the different kind of forms of the word, of the present continuous. We see them in a table in a similar way, the short answers, all the different forms, are you, negatives, questions, etc. And that's often presented as a kind of block for the students to master through practice activities, etc. And, you know, in terms of this building block approach, everybody will be familiar with this kind of, particularly at low levels, kind of beginner, elementary, where you'll start with the present verb to be. We'll do a couple of units on that. Then there'll be a few units on present simple. Then we might introduce past be, past regular verbs, past irregular verbs, maybe negatives and questions. Then we move on to present continuous, etc. The other aspect to this is that we often try to separate out meanings of this grammar. So we get present continuous meaning about now, right now, and then maybe present continuous for future. And we move on in this way. It's a kind of building block, I think, which is quite familiar to a lot of people. So how you're creative within this view of grammar? Well, again, if I just take an example from this is the Russian, this is like we might use visuals to kind of describe, help explain our way of the rule behind the grammar. What I would say here is there's while the visuals may be interesting, stimulating for students, what we need to bear in mind is whether they are clear for students. And, you know, for example, okay, here we might see the player, this is what the nominative case, but how can we make these connections? If you look at this is a very early book, it's, you know, from 1979, but it gives you a similar kind of idea where the students are given these pictures and we see they're going to jump, they're jumping, he has jumped, he's hit the bar and he's crashed. And we're kind of illustrating present continuous, future, past, present perfect. The question for me is, again, how clear are these distinctions? Do they really help the students? Because surely at the bottom, being creative with grammar must also be about helping the students use that grammar effectively. And, you know, just taking this example, which one is he's hitting the bar, he's just hit the bar, well, which one is which? It's not always very clear. A very common other kind of creative use, you may have come across these before. I took this just from a website. You can see the URL above, are timelines. So we draw timelines to illustrate to students the meanings of grammar. And this is kind of typical kind of creativity that you might have experienced if you've done a CELTA, it might have been recommended. But again, what we need to be honest to ourselves is how far these are really clear to students in being able to differentiate when you use one form or another. So, I mean, just for example, you know, actions happening now, actions happening around now. I mean, there's a visual aid in showing that there is a similar concept behind them, but the difference between the two is not really clarified by the visuals. And, you know, you could look through these, all of these, and have those similar questions. They may offer something, but they're also creating problems at the same time. Similarly, if you're studying the same kind of grammar forms in these kinds of order, so the grammar syllabus is quite rigid, particularly at kind of lower levels. What we often do to differentiate, or course books certainly try and do to differentiate between each other, is to bring a kind of creativity in terms of the kind of context, creating memorable context for the students to experience and understand the rule of the grammar we're teaching. So, I mean, for example, one course book, Teaching Going To, they looked at, it was like a game show where they were replacing holidays. So they go on a holiday, they think they're going to some place and say, no, you're not going to this place, you're going somewhere else. Or we have kind of quizzes. More recently, you would get, rather than presenting particular context, like a game show, an invented context, we might take a text which might be based on, I don't know, a local radio show or TV show. I mean, apart from the fact that these TV shows may be particular to the UK or Europe and may not be similar elsewhere, or the celebrities that are used may not be the same celebrities elsewhere or known elsewhere. These are seen as the kind of creative, interesting, motivating ways of placing our grammar in context. I remember when I was growing up, when I was starting out as a teacher, there was a song by Suzanne Vega, which included like 16 different examples of the present continuous, and it was a very popular way to present that form. The question is that how that form is used? And similarly, when you come to the fun practice, again, what we might have are games, often are seen as a creative way of using the grammar. Typical ones you might have come across: describe and draw. So, for example, I was doing a class using a book, and we had to describe two pictures, and the other person, they're paintings, and the other person had to attempt to draw that picture.
I don't know why anyone.
It's a kind of creative practice. Maybe we interview each other and then report on these interviews as ways to practice reported speech. What the consequences of these blocks are, creativity, are often quite unusual examples of grammar. So the one, for example, about the game show is you're not going to New York, and you kind of think, well, what context would a student tell somebody that they're not going somewhere? Okay, maybe a parents to their child, but in a kind of normal EFL or English second language speaking environment, we might have something like Dracula didn't live in Brazil. Okay, it might illustrate the past simple. It's come from a quiz where they're kind of discussing where Dracula was, facts about Dracula and other literary characters. But again, it's not something anybody would normally say. We might get interesting facts. Apparently this is true, but it's not actually how the students are going to be employing comparatives most of the time. They're not going to be saying things like this. This one was from that describe and draw activity. And this is what I ended up writing on the board, because the student was trying to say this thing. And I, as a good teacher, I hope, was helping them to try and say it correctly. But afterwards, I thought, well, when is somebody going to say this? Even if you went to a gallery, why would you say, look, there's a fat man sitting on a blanket playing the guitar? Yes, I can see that. Thanks. I mean, it's not what we do normally in real life. If we went to a gallery, we would ask, do you like it? And talk about why we liked it or not. And similarly, we can get into these kinds of uses of, reporting whole conversations in reported speech based on our interview. But again, while this may illustrate the grammar, it's not actually what we do in real life, and it's not really how reported speech works. So it then kind of creates a difficulty for students in that they are focused on this context of trying to be accurate in an odd situation. And then can they actually then transfer that into their real life? So this kind of brings us to kind of question, well, if these kind of aspects of creativity clashes with your beliefs about language and learning. So, as a more lexical teacher, these are things I believe. And if you believe them in a similar way, we might want to reassess what we do and think about creativity and how we use it in terms of teaching grammar. So it might be that what we teach should reflect how language is used, what the students will do with the language. From my point of view, words drive communication more than grammar, although, grammar is obviously needed. Natural usage will reveal ambiguities of some of the meanings that we tell students. So the students kind of have to deal with that. Students can't actually develop accuracy from the rules and words, as we'll see. I don't think that's true. Accuracy, I think, develops through familiar contexts where we're having these familiar conversations and repeating them over and over again over a period of time. And that's how we develop this kind of fluency and accuracy kind of go together. I think that genuine communication, you know, can't isolate one form of grammar. We can't do conversations in only the present simple tense most of the time, or only in the past tense even most of the time. So we need to kind of be able to deal with these things all at once. And this is where maybe my creativity is thinking about. I actually think rather than from fun and games, enjoyment and motivation comes through genuine communication, being able to actually use language to reflect myself, my personality, my identity. So let's kind of just take a look at these very quickly. Why I think these are true, why these are my beliefs. So the first thing is this: what does grammar mean? If we take this, have been ing, what was the person communicating? Imagine we reduced the communication to the grammar form. What can we say? What can we do? If you compare that, you could add a little bit extra, some more grammar words, but it's still not really communicating very much. Whereas if you kind of give just simple words on their own, I'm not suggesting this is what we should do, but if we imagined it in this way, basically we can get an idea of what the students are trying to get at. Okay, that basically, for example, they want to see a film and maybe they wanted to see it for a long time. Similarly, if we look at these examples, what level are they? And what makes them more difficult? If you have a quick look through, I think basically what I would say is they become more or less more difficult as we go down the list. But what's making them more difficult is not the grammar, it's the words that go with them. It's the vocabulary actually which makes these sentences more tricky for students. And the underlying grammar, although there are differences that we could imagine, moving from around now to future to trends and these kind of things, that's what's causing the difficulty. And if you look at something like the general scale of English, this is from Pearson's kind of items that they apply to different levels. What you see is grammar kind of, yes, it's important, actually more important at the lower levels, but basically after B1, it's almost irrelevant. So basically what's happening here is the students are attempting to become more fluent and accurate with the grammar that they've encountered already. And they do that through learning lots and lots more words. So the lesson of these points is essentially words drive communication, and they are more important. And although we're talking about teaching grammar creatively, I do want you to keep that in mind, that actually the words are still what's more important for most students and in communication. And if we look at explanation and meaning, and we go, what are you doing? Is this talking about now or the future? If we add a question, maybe it becomes obvious. Oh, it's talking about now. But what do we mean by now here? What are you doing? Nothing. What are you doing now? Nothing much. The other person, do you want to go for a coffee? Now it appears that the doing, what are you doing, is not really talking about this second. It's talking about around now, as in, well, really, is it future? What if we saw the student said, what are you doing now? I'm going to the bank. Is I'm going here now or the future? What if we said this? Does that change the meaning? It seems to me that they're basically the same things going on here. But in changing the surrounding words, we create ambiguity about the meaning, the underlying meaning of I'm going. Similarly, if we change it, I'm going to the library to do some work, maybe that makes it more about now and less about the future. I'm going to do some work. Is this now or the future? Well, yeah, maybe we know it's the future, but what about somebody is coming to stay? We're planning to go. I'm hoping to find. We treat these ones as examples of present continuous, though they are talking about the future, whereas we treat I'm going here as I'm going to as a separate kind of form. And I just don't think that's we're able to do these distinctions between meanings. So the lessons from this point is that really any students will struggle to learn from an explanation to become the accuracy, because they'll struggle to become accurate. Sorry, I've written it wrong. Because grammar meanings are fuzzy and ambiguous. And in real life, speakers tolerate this ambiguity because the context of the conversation and the meanings of their exchanges are clear. We understand what the other person is trying to say because we're in that particular moment. And often what happens with the grammar games type of thing and the made up context is what we're doing is we're removing all of that genuine communicative context to create something different. And it makes it's difficult then for students. I mean, the same kind of is true about words as well. So if you look at these examples and you think, what is the translation of pull in each case? And how do you know that's the right translation? Just have a look and think about it yourself for a second. I mean, what you learn, I think, is that, I mean, maybe the pulling the shirt and pulling a trailer or a car along is the same word in your language, but in some languages it may be different. The way we pull something out of something may be a different word in another language. How we pull out and what this it means depends actually a lot on what the it is. So the pull out also changes because of when we add without looking or out of the deal, it changes the meaning somewhat. So it's difficult to actually separate out the individual meaning of the word from the surrounding grammar. And that's the lesson from this, that basically meanings of words are also fuzzy, and what they're dependent on are the words and the grammar that they go with. So single words plus grammar won't, I should add, produce accuracy. It's almost impossible for the students to be efficient users of grammar, if you like, in that way. And then the last little thing, if we look at this, this is very common for native speakers. They go when they're learning, they start by using we went correctly, little babies and toddlers or whatever, and then they often start saying we go to the park yesterday. And then what happens after that? They go back to using went. So they overemphasize the rule, but then they go back to what people actually say. This isn't kind of an unusual idea. Walkley and Sider were researchers from the 80s who kind of wrote a seminal paper about kind of these chunks, if you like, and the natural choices that native speakers makes. And they give this example of telling the time. Now, if all of these are grammatically correct, according to the rules we might give of grammar and the words that we teach, but actually most of them aren't said by native speakers, and they're not things that you would want to teach, I imagine. And this is the point, that actually the usage, well, the lessons really, usage always wins over rules. So it's how language is used in real life, which kind of creates the patterns of grammar, that creates the kind of underlying meanings and rules that we are following. But but we have to stick to those. The rules, giving rules and adding words, again, it can't produce accuracy. And furthermore, why don't we choose it exceeds 5 by 40? Well, we don't know. We can't, because people don't. Ultimately, explanations won't help. So how do you get that knowledge and accuracy? Well, I think firstly, we have to understand that for most students, it will be never. If you're a B1 student, for example, you will be inaccurate by definition. It happens over a long period of time. Yes, maybe through repetition and maybe through some study. But I think the study will be limited because the explanation, the rule, can't account for all the possible usage ideas that we have. So really, the most likely is exposure over time. So you're seeing these forms over and over again. You know, I'm sure a lot of you fluent speakers will have read a lot, seen lots of this language in action. Maybe you lived in a English-speaking country. You listen to English-speaking radio, so you're getting lots of exposure to this over time. And in terms of practice, also you're consistently recalling, so not reading it out, but recalling, remembering examples, reusing it, sometimes failing, but then eventually successfully. And over time, you're doing that over and over and over again. And that's what creates the fluency and accuracy together, if you're going to make it. But what we have to remember is most students won't. So this should change our way of thinking about a little bit about creativity and how we are treating grammar in the classroom. Okay. How might that be creative approach then to grammar that I'm talking about? And we'll see examples of in the next part of the webinar. I suppose where I'm coming from then is how we are creative has to be about challenging some of these grammar orthodoxies that we've seen. And some of the things I'm going to say and show you may not seem very creative in the kind of fun, doing something different, artistic, those kinds of ideas of creativity. What we're doing is conceiving language teaching almost a bit more differently. That's where the creativity comes, and enabling students, adapting to students on the fly, if you like, while they're with them, making use of student output. This is where the creativity of use of grammar is. So summarizing where I'm going to be looking at in the next part of where we look at some more kind of practical ways of going about this, I'm thinking about reorganizing the syllabus around conversations rather than grammar blocks, especially at the lowest levels. I would be thinking about ensuring repetition, not a very creative type of thing, but essential for teaching grammar for the needs of the students. And that's where I think is we're not doing at the moment often. Not expecting accuracy outside certain routines at low levels. Enabling grammar to be taught as vocabulary. This is quite a step away from a lot of current course material. Maybe not teaching all the forms of a piece of grammar when the students first encounter it. Actually kind of looking at only a couple of forms. Again, not what is usually done. But maybe teaching several different forms within that restricted form. Okay, we'll be seeing examples of this. Getting students, not explaining, kind of encouraging students' tolerance of ambiguity. So trying to release ourselves from rules and explanations. Thinking about different contrasts in grammar than the ones which we traditionally teach, not teaching certain structures of forms. And then within that, giving priority to vocabulary, but rather than treating vocabulary as single words, using vocabulary to present and draw attention to grammar consistently over time. And then finally, and maybe the most important, making use of the student outputs to teach grammar. So it's the kind of the student's creativity, if you like, within a kind of routine that we can make use of to teach and draw attention to grammar forms. Okay, I'm going to stop for like a 5 minutes, 5-minute break or so, just to have a look at any kind of questions or for you to kind of reflect on that. Any
I've got a few questions.
Questions there? Yeah.
Got a few questions, Andrew. Some quite large, broad ones. Quite an interesting one for a textbook writer. Does this all mean that we shouldn't follow course books if they're not really that creative?
One is, it depends on the course book. Obviously, I'm very biased in that point of view. So, you know, I do believe I've written some course books differently. Okay, so I'm writing to those, closer to those beliefs. They're not exactly the same because all course books are compromises because they have to be sold to teachers who maybe don't have the same beliefs as I do. But I think that, as we'll see as we go forward, there are ways that we can add to what's in the course book. So it's not necessarily abandoning them completely. It's more to do with how we bring these sensibilities, which I've just illustrated, written up here on this slide, to the existing material that we have.
How do you evaluate the success of a single lesson if you take a creative view of grammar teaching?
I think evaluation, again, if we're going to what we have here, the evaluation for me is, did the students learn anything about each other? Did they learn any new language? That's anything. Could be vocabulary, could be grammar. Did they have the opportunity to put that language to use? And again, that opportunity could come in all kinds of different ways. And they might not take the opportunity. It doesn't matter. It's so long as you are providing the possibility for that opportunity, that's more important. Because over time, they will, we hope, take these opportunities as they become more exposed to the language that they're trying to use and become better at doing it.
And a couple of questions about teacher education. Should we consider a more organic, holistic approach to language teaching? And if so, what what are the implications for teacher evaluation? And allied to that, do you think teacher training course providers should shift away from concentration on aims and outcomes?
The short answer to the aims and outcomes is certainly the aims, definitely. Outcomes is a different matter. I consider these as different things. So I see an outcome as really what we'll be looking at now, as what the students will be able to do with their language, whatever language they actually use in the end, but they have some kind of practical. It doesn't have to be always practical in the sense of going to a shop or something, but they have a kind of genuine exchange with each other. And that's the outcome I'm working towards, and enabling the students to have that and helping them to do that. The aims is I think where we've got into the kind of creative problem, is really what we're looking at the beginning of what I talked about, where we take a grammar rule and that's what we're trying to present. And so we look for creative ways of doing that, and we end up often creating maybe fun. I'm not saying that these aren't enjoyable classes, or they might not be, memorable, but they create odd language usage, and they're not reflective of what students are actually doing. And often they don't actually exchange their thoughts and feelings and talk about themselves at all, because it's a game. Okay, can we move on? I'll come back to the teacher training thing, perhaps, hopefully have a little time at the end.
Okay.
So let's go through and see how we might fulfill some of these in kind of practical ways in terms of, doing these things. So this first idea about organizing around conversation, I'm talking especially here about lower levels, although I think kind of tasks and more broad discussions and speaking should be kind of a central part of higher levels. We will see an example of that. But what I want to think about is repetition of routines. And what I mean by routines are the kinds of typical conversations we have over and over and over again. Why I use this is it comes from the Common European Framework. This is the CFR general guide can-do statements about what a B1 student can do in terms of output and accuracy. And I draw your attention to they know enough sufficient vocabulary to express themselves over quite a variety of different things. I mean, these are quite large areas, actually, current events being particularly large, that we probably underplay. But this one's the key one I want to focus on, is use reasonably accuracy, a repertoire of frequently used routines and patterns associated particularly in situations. So basically what it's saying is that within the context of very familiar conversations, they can achieve a certain kind of accuracy. But I would say, because of our grammar syllabus, often the students don't get actually enough repeated practice of these simple routine conversations. Now, we can add them quite easily, I think, as teachers, and they might complement. Maybe we're getting the best of both worlds in answer to that earlier question. So if we think of what kind of routines I mean, I'm thinking about these kinds of things. How are you? Where are you from? What do you do? What are you doing now? Did you have a nice weekend? I mean, I'm sure a lot of you will think, well, I do these already. But I think what happens is, yes, we have where are you from in the first unit, first lesson, but then it's not really seen again. And we don't really explore how these conversations developed, because they're focused on the grammar. So where are you from? I'm from Jordan. I'm from Algeria. Not that those countries will feature in the list of most course books, but that's another matter. How would the conversation normally continue? What would, if you were talking to another foreign person, how would that conversation continue? Similarly with how are you? We have it in the first unit, maybe. But just look at, for example, the tape script, the audio scripts of course books, and have a look how many times how are you, or where are you from, or what do you do, or where are you doing? How often do these get recycled within the material? So just think a moment, what would be the continuation of these conversations? I like to think about an idea called vertical development. This is my own term, it's completely invented, but it's the idea that language conversations develop in a way as a kind of interview, question, answer, question, answer, question, answer, kind of vertical way. But these are kind of logical, typical of all languages. Most languages will tend to go in a very similar way. And then there's also kind of horizontal development where we kind of give a reply, but add something, add comments or make an explanation or whatever. And I think at the lowest levels, we want to concentrate on these kind of questions. These are the kinds of things I would be thinking about. Where exactly do you know? Is it near? Have you been there? So here, immediately we go, have you been here? We're edging towards a different grammar form, which they won't see till the end of elementary. And then it will be mixed with lots of other forms of present perfect, rather than practicing how we use have been. And so what I think we could do is we could incorporate some of these conversations. How can we do that? Well, one is to treat grammar as vocabulary. So one thing we could do is, for example, this is from my course book, but you can do this. I mean, it's easy for you to, anybody can add it. So, if we're doing something on places, they've learned restaurant, hotel, market, whatever. We could just teach them the question, what's the best restaurant in your city? And we teach the word best, not as a superlative, as good, better, best, but just as a word. Maybe we translate it. And then we just get the students to practice. We're not asking them to compare restaurants, although potentially that might occur, and we can respond to it as the students produce language. If they try to say different things, we can respond, and especially higher, students who are a bit better, they might try and say a bit more, and you can help them along with that. But essentially, the answers to these questions are the names of places. They're not difficult. It's not difficult language. Similarly with have you been? Have you been here before? No. I mean, you might have taught 2 years ago before. Or we could just, have you been here have you been to country name? But it doesn't have to be a country name. It could be city name. Have you been to Cairo? Have you been to Rome? Have you been to Baghdad? We could just use the names of your local names of the city. The students just say no or yes. But it's a genuine conversation. That may lead to other things. And we could look at that in a moment. Here's another example of just like, where are you going? This actually came from an example. I was buying a ticket in a train station, and the person helping me asked where I was going. I thought it was useful. Now, what I like to do is do a thing called dialogue building. And how this works is basically you introduce a kind of key, one of those starting questions that we had in our typical routines, and we build on them with the students. So how this would work. So, for example, imagine we wanted to work towards this conversation. So this is a kind of typical routine, inviting somebody to do something. So you ask them what they're doing whenever it is, you tell them, the other person replies, maybe invites them. I mean, these are idealized conversations, but they're close to the real thing. The student often, in response to that, might ask a question. or look at the possible questions. They might give her then the answer to that question. They agree a time to tell her a time or place to meet, and they kind of conversation. This is what we're working towards. Okay. How we would start off with building the conversation. What we would start with is just giving the students the question. So I would go, what are you doing later? And I might translate it for the students to make sure they've understood it. I'd get them to repeat it. Everybody, what are you doing later? And as each person replies and repeats, they go, what are you doing later? I would reply, oh, I'm going to the park. And then I ask somebody else, Alan, what are you doing later? That Alan repeats, what are you doing later? Alan says, what are you doing later? I go, oh, I'm going to meet a friend. And I would give different answers. We have to imagine this is not the first, they probably will know most of these words, but they probably don't know the grammar that goes with them. Because this is actually, you could do this at beginner, elementary, whatever. And then I would ask them, so what are you doing later? And get them to answer. And then we would have a little practice, and I might kind of get them to ask, and you. So at the first instance, they would just practice this, have a little pair work, da, da, da. Then I would go on to the next stage. I would elicit again, maybe ask a student, what are you doing later? And the other person says, oh, I'm going to the park. And you says, oh, I'm going to have coffee. Okay. Do you want to come? And I would elicit, then kind of, again, present the next stage. Okay. And I would drill that. Do you want to come? Everybody, do you want to come? Again, they probably know this one as well. It's not, and then I might elicit. So how would you reply? Do you want to come? And again, either get them to repeat to me and I give different answers, or maybe in this case, we could just elicit directly. How could you answer that question? And the students might go, yes, no, maybe. And we can change the language. Okay, yeah, well, yeah, we often say sure. No, I'd be a bit more polite. Yeah, I can't, I'm sorry. Okay, and we can kind of provide that. Again, now they go through this stage in pairs, they practice this little kind of conversation. Come back to the teacher. We go, what are you doing? We write this up on the board. Maybe we elicit this onto the board at this point. And then I put a question mark. Sure. What would you ask next? And we could elicit then what the students think they would ask next. Now, obviously, quite often they will say things like, who go? Who go with you? And it's oh, yeah. Who's going with you? So listen, who's going with you? Or which park? We could just keep that. Which park? Or we could have which park are you going to? Or where are you going? We can adapt depending on the level the students are presenting to us, because obviously they may be finding it more or less difficult. In this case, we might choose one of those and give the replies, or we might kind of give a selection and the students reply. And then we build up the next stage. They have a practice where they use this format, again in pairs. And then to finish, perhaps we might say, so what do we need to do next? Again, you might ask that in your own language to the students, get them thinking about how they would work this conversation in their own language, and then provide them with the language. So great, I'll meet you at 3. I'll meet you outside the school. I'll meet you, and then maybe get the students to think about possible endings. Again, it's kind of creativity on the students' part rather than based on reality, but it's something that they can work with themselves. and then they practice the whole thing all together. So they're getting lots of repetition, but they're also seeing these chunks. These are involving levels of grammar, which as chunks, which they wouldn't be able to access to have a conversation like this till they'd finished. Well, I mean, if we were going with Will, probably till somewhere in pre-intermediate. Now, in terms of the question about the course book, well, we don't have to completely abandon the course book. All we could do is to think about, I mean, often there are examples. It's not that there aren't these examples in the course book. It's just that they are not treated as the goal. They're not treated as the outcome. They're just treated as the way to present the grammar rule. So what we could do is to do what's in the course book, work on the grammar as it's there, but maybe then add to it by taking one of these examples and just I don't know why it's not come up. Maybe sorry, I missed the thing. Maybe just adding to these questions. It could be those ones which we saw before. Sorry. So where are you from? Kind of things we might develop this conversations. Then asking which part, do you know it? Maybe have you been there? Or who's Ben? Is my brother? Does he live here? Where does he live? What does he do? And what you'll see actually is a kind of recycling of these routines through different conversations. So do you like horror films? No, I prefer comedies. Oh, have you seen Poor Things? It's really funny. And we might teach them, have you seen blank? It's really good. As a kind of chunk which they can make use of within the conversation that we're presenting. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way around. Just another way of doing this, very, very briefly, is it's an idea called messaging. It's from George Woolard. It's a book, an ebook you can buy. And basically, if you take it can be summed up by this. If you kind of take this kind of conversation, which we typically teach in first lesson, there's actually quite a bit of different grammar in this one, but we don't think twice about teaching it because what stays the same and what changes? Well, obviously what stays the same is everything except for the name. So we can almost learn it as by rote. Again, it's not particularly creative, but the purpose is creative in my mind. It's to engage with real life. And basically what George is suggesting is you provide other examples of these typical conversations, and you get the students to think about which bits they could keep and reuse for themselves. So we could take a longer conversation like this, and what they would do is they would reuse these chunks. I mean, we could highlight these initially for the students and get them to rewrite, we could present it like this even, and get the students to rewrite the bits in red. So they create a new kind of conversation. And then they try and remember them. They have to remember, recall, and make use of them in that way. What you'll have noticed here is the idea that some of those grammar forms were broke out of our traditional grammar usage. In particular, you might have noticed this. Again, this is from my book, but it's just in a way to emphasize that students can take it on. What we can do is we could go further than the basic dialogue, and we can show them patterns of how grammar works. But what we're doing is not doing it as a rule and a kind of narrow meaning. What we're doing is showing them how the pattern works, thinking about it in terms of the pattern within this narrow context. So here we'd have I'm going, we're going, because basically in these kinds of conversations, we're only interested in me and you. We don't need to know about he, George Clooney, president of Egypt or whatever. We just need to know these kind of conversations. And then what we can show them is a pattern where we can add where we're going, what. In a way, these are the grammar of the word go, really. That's how we're really showing it. But what we're showing is we can either show them where we're going, or we can show them what we're going to do. And the students can understand that this is basically the same thing in this context. And we can show them also that it could be now, but it could be tomorrow, it could be tonight, etc. And we can give them patterns of how we can get the students to manipulate these patterns, a kind of standard type of grammar task. Or we could get them to create their own examples. And what we're doing is, if a student, I mean, my experience is the students don't ask whether it's now or the future. They understand, because it's a context of having this conversation, what the meanings are. They don't very rarely ask. But yeah, if a student did, or if we feel that we should try and stay a difference between these going as a present continuous and present going to as a future form, I suggest we resist. That we let this ambiguity exist for students, because differentiating, giving different meanings is not going to make any difference to them. It's not going to help them to make use of those forms, because the forms are ambiguous. They aren't clearly defined. So similarly, what we could do is, when we are, in other circumstances at higher levels, maybe what we could do is resist trying to differentiate between meanings, try and give a basic unified meaning and sticking to it, and getting the students to think, well, how does this relate to this basic meaning? And if it doesn't, not worrying about it, and trying to encourage the students not to worry about it, because it's essentially not important, and trying to find a difference won't help them create new accurate sentences anyway. So for me, mine is taken more or less from Meaning in the English Verb by Michael Lewis, which was also based heavily on an old grammar book by, I don't know what his first name is, Close is the surname, which is present continuous. It's basically temporary, unfinished, and around now. And that's basically it. There's nothing else to say about it. And more or less, all of these sentences could fit into that. Even the future ones, because we could say, yes, well, it's temporary. We're not meeting a couple of friends every night. It's around now because the plan has started, and it's unfinished. The plan started, but it's not finished. We haven't met them yet. So in that sense, it can easily fit. Crime is getting worse. We hope that it's temporary. It's around now, and we expect it to get worse at the moment. It's unfinished, and so you could possibly do this with other. You can do it with other grammar forms. It's resisting the urge to separate, talk about exceptions, different meanings, letting the students kind of deal with that ambiguity by dealing with it ourselves, I suppose. Connected to that is maybe thinking about, I think often we get into trouble with explanations because the contrasts we give are difficult to explain. They're very nuanced. Yet actually real life, those differences in real conversations, they're we don't need those differences to be spelt out because the contrasts in different forms are completely different. So, for example, we kind of think present perfect simple v present perfect continuous. How we to try and differentiate these, must and have to, trying to differentiate these ones, and then doing exercises to try and differentiate them. Whereas in fact, if we think about the conversation, maybe we just could focus. For example, when we're teaching, again, we could be working within the current course book. So we have a thing, what's your job? I'm a teacher. We might ask about your dad, what's your dad's job? Or what does your dad do? Oh, he's retired. We might need to teach them retired. But we might then want to ask, oh, what did he do? So we might be teaching did and was, and present that to students, because the contrast is very, very clear. All we're really doing is teaching the past form of am at this point. And that would just enable a little bit more conversation and genuine interaction between the students. Because maybe the students want to say, well, I'm a teacher now, but I was a train driver or whatever it is that they want to say, or, they've changed their jobs, as lots of people do. We could teach, I mean, again, you might see an example in a course book. In fact, I have normal, genuine course book, I can't come to class. Okay. And what we could do is, for example, firstly, we might want to, I can't come to class, I have to go to a meeting. We could teach them have to at that point to support that conversation. Or if the students kind of can say this already, we might teach them couldn't, to show them how they could excuse themselves for not being at the class. So we could kind of, these are not difficult contrasts. They're very clearly different. One is past, one's present. And it's not, we could contrive of also gap fills to kind of get them to fill in can, can't, or couldn't according to the gap. Similarly, we talked about going, went, etc. I mean, this is interesting in terms of why I meant about exploring how have been is used more as a conversation. We could be teaching have you been, that's in the course book. What we might be exploring a bit more is, rather than just only looking at the use of past simple and present perfect in text, we could be exploring how the answers work. Have you been to Egypt? No, but I'd like to. No, but I'm going in the summer. We can almost, again, teach these as chunks. We don't have to be teaching all aspects, he, she, it, what, when, etc. What we're doing is presenting, different forms, a narrow set of the grammar to help them have the conversation. These are examples. We wouldn't necessarily teach all of these at the same time. And, in terms of like how long, we could be contrasting how long have you been doing it, so how long did you do it? So like, if you're talking about hobbies, rather than getting into the difference between present perfect, simple, and continuous and focusing on that, we could be saying, oh, well, I used to play a lot of football, but I stopped. Oh, how long did you do that? Oh, years, but, and then maybe exploring why you gave up. We could just not teach them structures, as I mentioned. Things I'm thinking of, I mean, these are just examples. There are various ones of my bugbears. Maybe reported speech, have to, must, just not worry about the difference. Present perfect continuous, perhaps we just don't worry about the difference. Students get by with either, even if it's not exactly what a native person might say. It's not important. Try to do, try doing. Is there a difference? Is it worth explaining? I would say if these are issues when the students are speaking, you might kind of correct it at that point. But otherwise, we create problems by presenting these as differences and try to practice these as differences. we get into strange territories, a bit like, and we might even kind of question like whether we should be differentiating will and going to. So is this worth it? I mean, I live this as a kind of controversial choice, but perhaps will we focus on in terms of promises, saying things we do, and then we use going to all the rest of the time. And if the students overuse will, it doesn't matter, because if they're B1, certainly they're going to be inaccurate anyway. We could focus on kind of using grammaticalized lexis. So again, I mean, this is really a little bit dependent on the course book, unfortunately, but we could be thinking about, just rather than single word exercise, matching to meanings, matching to pictures, these kinds of things, is basically providing more things which the students might actually say in their entirety with the key words, that we're focusing on. So the students, they're doing it's a vocab exercise. They have to process the whole thing. But we could, when they're going through the answers, so what's the answer here? Yeah, it's turn off the aircon. Because it's cold. Yeah. I'm going to now or the future. Okay, we could just kind of remind them of the general form, if you like. Is this the past or now? Okay, and you see that in this exercise. Basically, they're completing similar things, but what we're giving them are grammaticalized words, basically. So the words, they have to understand the meanings. That this is, we need rain here, not is or was or a form of is. But then they still have to also think about the grammar ending. So they're kind of combining the two. At a higher level, this is an example from our upper intermediate book. It's about talking about crime. Is a very common topic, but typically the way this topic vocabulary is presented is kind of thief, theft, murder, murderer, rob, robber, robbery. So kind of forms of single words. It's kind of grammar, but it's not actually what we say. If we're actually talking about a crime and what happens, we use all kinds of other language, which often the students don't have access to. So the first point is working from the outcome, talking about a crime, and thinking actually what is the language which we use there, and feeding that into our vocabulary exercise. But it's secondly, if there is a vocabulary exercise like this, which have grammaticalized sentences, we can also kind of draw attention to grammar as we're going through the answers. So occasionally, not for everyone, but we could just say, oh, look, someone must have got hold of it. Why must have here? Why must have? Do we know this is what happened? Not exactly. We could interrogate that, and maybe give a translation if that's appropriate. We could get students or ourselves, if we've got a word list, we could just get the student, we could give word lists which are grammaticalized themselves. So, not all of these, but maybe providing examples rather than just think means this in your language. We present a form, a grammaticalized form, where the students are then getting repeated exposure to how this word works, but also repeated exposure to other bits of grammar. And then the last area I'm going to look at is thinking about this student output. It's letting the task do the work for grammar to emerge and for us to draw attention to it as we go along. And again, this is something we can do with a normal course book, where there will often be tasks there, particularly as we go up the levels. Again, lower levels, maybe we need to provide an outcome type of task, which allows for a bit more variety of language. But certainly, as we go up the levels, all course books have lots of speaking activities. and they're not necessarily connected with the grammar. So this is from our second edition outcomes. We've got a new edition now, but they have these kind of pictures. The students just have to talk about what they think has happened in the photo, what's happening. You can imagine the story. And through that, it's not a grammar exercise, it's not a vocabulary exercise. In a way, it's just a warmer. We could just get them to do the exercise, they have a discussion, we move on to the next thing. And that's what lots of teachers would do. But what I would say is, if we're thinking more creatively about grammar, what we would do is take a step back and think of this, well, what would they actually want to say? Think about the possibilities of grammar that we could draw attention to in the things they want to say, and draw attention to that in some feedback for the students. Kind of like a task-based learning, if you're familiar with that. But within a normal, any kind of speaking activity. The speaking activity could be before a reading, after reading, etc. These are my ideas of what the students might have wanted to say. This is what I do to plan, actually, most of the time. I just kind of think of things which students might want to say. And I think about how I might adapt these for the level, or what I might want to draw attention to, that kind of thing. So, you can have a quick look and you can see the kind of ideas that come up. So the students are talking. Ideally, I would actually, you listen to what the students are actually trying to say, and use their examples to reformulate and give a focus. But it's quite difficult often if you've got big classes to hear students. You can't always pay attention to every single one. So, sometimes I just use the sentences that I thought of. So in these ones, I wouldn't necessarily be using all of them. I might choose two. And what I would do is I would write them up on the board. I thought, somebody was trying to say this, the guy looks a bit fed up, he's a bit down. And, I think they had an argument. What word might go here? Students suggest, maybe have had an argument. Yeah, but where's the you? Yeah, maybe they, where's the subject? Where maybe they have had an argument. We've got they here. They maybe have had an argument. Okay, we could do. Do you know any different word we could use? And we can elicit might. We might then give them, this one. I think they must have done something naughty. So again, we could elicit the word here. What's missing here? The student might say do. Yeah, but look, it's must have. So we're talking about the past here. Must have done. And then we could just illustrate, maybe this is something that they've seen before, in which case we're recycling and getting them to be aware of it again. Maybe it's the first time they've seen it, in which case, I might not even do the gap. I might tell them, I might just underline it and draw it, or I might ask them, let them get it wrong, and then it just quickly say, yeah, we often use this to say a very short explanation. Yes, it's an explanation, but I'm not expecting them to produce accuracy after this. What will occur is, when we come again, this is about using your normal course book. When they come to study this grammar, they will have seen it before, because you've drawn it out through their conversation when they were trying to use it. And you can remind them of when you did it. So they have a kind of peg to it. This is high level. So maybe I probably wouldn't do this with my intermediate group. My point actually is that you can use the same task with lots of different levels and adapt your grammar teaching creatively, if you like, to the different students that you have on different levels. An intermediate student, I might kind of draw attention to this. I might go, he a bit fed up. What's the word here? And we can just try and elicit. Maybe they know it already. Some students know, yeah, he looks a bit fed up. So, we might give a quick translation there. Or yeah, it's another word like this. It seems. Okay, maybe they know it, maybe they don't. Yeah, it's when we're guessing. And then we might say, so what goes here? He looks, and then maybe they try and say, he looks like cheeky. No, this is an adjective. Yeah, so we just say, look, he looks a bit fed up. He looks, and then maybe say, bit. Yeah, we need a bit. So anything like a bit, and then we add quite. So we're just drawing attention. What you will see is this is very similar to an FCE type of closed test. This is the kind of grammar which is often tested in exams. And what we're doing is kind of repeatedly exposing students to it. And then similarly here, we might go, what's the missing word? And then we go like, maybe they draw on that. So why like here? Why not nothing? And we can say, well, because it's followed by a clause, if you want to use that word, but it's not followed by an adjective, it's followed by a kind of sentence. Okay, and we can draw attention to that, to the students. We don't go further into the explanation, we just draw attention to it. We tell the students the meaning, but we're not expecting accuracy because they can't then just immediately produce it. What I'm thinking of here is it's either recycling what they've done before, reminding them over and over again because it comes through exposure and repetition, or we're kind of pre-cycling. We're kind of highlighting it for a moment. Students may remember or forget, but they'll study it again, and it might come up in another conversation again. We could focus more broadly on, just prepositions. You could find it could be just the words if you wanted to, because words are more important. We could gap these or highlight them, ask the students if they know the translation. Okay, so it gives you lots of opportunities for doing all kinds of different grammar. It could focus on one structure, it could focus on several. We could have one bit on look like, could be another on a past, a present perfect form, whatever we want to do. It's part of this recycling, revision, repeating. And that's it, basically. So in terms of teaching creativity, some ideas that you might want to try out. Maybe I gather you can write about these sessions if you want. Some of the kind of areas I'm thinking of, maybe try a class where you don't directly correct students' grammar. Maybe you just engage with them as students, as real people. And you build the conversation with them rather than necessarily focusing immediately on their error. Maybe you could try teaching some new grammar as a chunk within some kind of conversation, either as a response to what's in the book or not. Maybe take some, natural exchanges in the book and expanding on. You get the idea. There's lots of ideas there. So, any questions? Let's deal with that.
Yes, sure. I think there's an assumption behind this question, but let's see what you think. What to do about students who expect grammar rules to be taught first before vocabulary?
There's two kind of answers to this. It depends on your context. So this is maybe relates to the teacher development and institutional development. So first, you do need institutional support for taking this kind of view. So in that context, I would tell the students, it's not the best way of learning. And we could have a discussion with them about why it's not the best way of learning. And we can give them examples like I've given, to be honest. You might have to have this conversation in their own language. But where I say you need institutional support is if that student is persistent, what we have to start doing is telling them, you need to go to a different teacher. You need to go to a different school because this is not how I want to teach language. And it's not my beliefs about how language is best taught. So that's what you do. I mean, I think we are the experts. And if we have a better way, we need to help the students understand that better way and understand those ambiguities, that tolerance of ambiguity. Tolerance of ambiguity is, by the way, one of the traits of a good language learner, according to studies.
Related to that, do you think we should give grammar explanations after we work with chunks?
I think I think not unless they ask for it specifically, probably. Because the explanation of like, have you been to Egypt, for example, there isn't any explanation that we can give to that beginner student which will make any sense because they don't know enough about the rest of the system. There's no other way of fitting it into the system. So for that reason, you could give an explanation, but it won't make any difference to that student. It won't help them either to use that chunk or to use the wider language. What we might do is when we come to do present perfect as a more general, we might do, as I say, I'm conceiving of using normal books as well. And I do grammar kind of focused lessons occasionally where we're building on the kind of what the students have seen, using some of these chunks and exploring how those chunks are used. And there maybe we'd give some kind of basic grammar rule, but with the expectation that it's a basic grammar rule and that's it. If they ask, I still don't understand, further explanation won't help. You just have to have a go at doing it. And if they get it wrong, it doesn't matter because they're not going to get it right in the first instance. It's a process of time.
You've mentioned translating into students' first language a few times. And there's a question about the extent to which teachers should resort to or rely on L1.
I think if you think about the dialogue building that I did there, I was demonstrating. Where I would be using translation is in the first question. So I'd say, what are you doing later? And I would just translate that sentence. So the students have an understanding of where the conversation is starting. And after that, I hardly do any other translation. The translation may come from the student in where they try to give a reply. They say, I don't know, I'm going to the library, and they don't know the word library. And they might say their own language. And I say, yeah, library. So listen, going to the library. And I get them to practice it. So basically, translation is there just as giving the initial meaning to orient the students to the initial meaning. And that's it. And then the rest of it is practice in English. And occasionally, if the students have forgotten or they ask, I will remind them with that translation maybe. And then we're back to practicing English.
And perhaps the last question about error. How to deal with errors in a way that's going to be constructive and help learners to achieve greater accuracy in the long run.
So I've come to think there's a distinction here between the levels that we're teaching. So as we saw, if we're at B1, by definition, the students are inaccurate outside of these routines. So where I'd be looking to develop accuracy is through these routines. So if they keep on saying, what do you do last night? I would at some point I'd say, listen, what did you do last night? I might do it through the kind of gapping that we just did here, something like this, give them a sentence where the word is gapped and I elicit the word which is missing. They say, most students actually will end up saying did because they know it's did. It's just they've forgotten in the instance. And then what I'd be looking at is rather than kind of worrying too much in the replies, maybe if they've got something wrong, say they replied, I study English all weekend. I say, oh, I studied English. What did you study? What I would be focused on is what would be the next question, and I would be looking at to develop more that aspect. So yes, we would give them the clear examples, which is correct. But in terms of my expectations of the students, it's very low. I'm not expecting them to get correct. What I'm doing is helping them then to understand what the next step might be in that conversation, how they might explore it. At higher levels, yeah, then maybe we have a little bit more focus on accuracy because we're aiming to develop accuracy. But the accuracy still occurs from the repetition over time. And really, the way I'm doing it is through this, what I just showed you. This is more or less all I do. I give them the sentences they were trying to say, and I blank bits, which, I mean, maybe they got them wrong, maybe they didn't. But I'm using it for a public look for everybody to remind themselves of that bit of grammar. And as I say, these are the kinds of grammar actually which are often in exams, you know, those kind of closed tests rather than something, those kind of differential. I mean, nobody's tested on the differentiation between present perfect, simple, and continuous, for example. That's a very unusual test, which is doing that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. That was fascinating. I think people may have been expecting from the title of the webinar what you call funky topics and songs and games. But in fact, this was really creative language development in a very refined way. Made me think of the times I've taught some of those routines without going a step further into vertical development. Can I just say to everyone that I think this is one webinar, and these are always recorded, but this is one webinar where it will be really valuable, I think, to return to the recording. Even if you've been here for the last hour and a half and been concentrating, it was so rich in examples and demonstrations, some of which went by quite quickly, and I think there'll be really
yes, I'm sorry.
No, not at all.
Got to cram it all in.
They'll be really worth revisiting and pausing and thinking about. Amira Goma, our colleague from British Council Cairo, has posted the link several times in the chat and in the Q&A to the feedback survey. If you complete that and submit it, you then get an automatic response giving you a second link to download your own certificate. And just one other thing, you may recall or you may not know that linked to these webinars is an opportunity for you to submit a short assignment in the form of some kind of teaching plan. Could be a lesson plan, it could be just a plan for an activity or sequence of activities. It could be something more like a scheme of work over several lessons. I'm just about to post my email address in the chat box. And if you would like to send us an assignment, some kind of teaching plan, please send it to me by email. I'll pass them on to Andrew and you'll get some feedback on those. And I think that's everything. We have one more webinar in this series next month, and you'll be receiving information about that. The recording
Yeah.
of this evening's webinar will be available within the next few days. Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah, no, I was just saying thank you all for coming, and a little if you would like to see a little bit more about what we do check out our site. It's lexicallab.com, and we do have like an Instagram and various social medias where there's free and paid type of training around. So yeah, thank you very, very much for inviting me, and hope you all enjoyed it.
Thanks again, Andrew, and thank you, everyone. See you next month.
Bye now.